Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to evening 3 of the World Affairs Councils of America's 2020 National Conference, New Frontiers in Diplomacy and National Security. This is our third keynote in a row. We are going for a full virtual week of our national conference, and we're delighted to bring you this special distinguished panel this evening on the topic of a global economy in turmoil, the outlook for 2021. We have two guests and a moderator, and I'll introduce them now. You'll be able to ask your questions from the YouTube Live chat box, and we will convey them to our speakers at about the 20-minute mark of our program. We're here for 45 minutes, and it's my pleasure to introduce first Abby Joseph Cohen. She's an advisory director and senior investment strategist at Goldman Sachs. She began her career as an economist at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. Abby joined Goldman in 1990, becoming its first female head of investment strategy and made partner in 1998. She was the firm's chief U.S. strategist until 2008, and that year became president of the Global Markets Institute, Goldman's in-house research think tank, which she led until 2017. Abby's also presidential counselor at Cornell University, her alma mater, and she's a member of the board of executive committees at the Brookings Institution here in D.C. and the Jewish Theological Seminary. An adjunct professor at Columbia University and a guest lecturer at other graduate schools of business, Abby was a member of the Obama White House's Innovation Advisory Board for Economic Competitiveness. Jeffrey E. Garten is Dean Emeritus of the Yale School of Management. Jeffrey was dean at the school from 1995 to 2005 and has taught courses on the global economy and crisis management ever since. He is the author of the forthcoming book, 3 Days at Camp David, How a Secret Meeting in 1971 Transformed the World Economy. Jeffrey served as Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade in the Clinton administration, and before government service, he spent 13 years on Wall Street and was managing director of the Blackstone Group. And last but not least, Sarwar Kashmiri. He will moderate this panel. Sarwar is known to us very well. He is the author of 3 books, most recently China's Grand Strategy, Weaving a New Silk Road to Global Supremacy. WACA was pleased to serve as the DC launch party for the book, presenting Sarwar in conversation with former US Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel at last year's WACA National Conference. Sarwar is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Association, which is sponsoring tonight's talk with Abby and Jeffrey on the outlook for our ravaged global economy, and COVID-19 pandemic continues like never before. We look to your advice and your insights. Thank you, and Sarwar, take it away.
Thank you very much, Bill. I appreciate that gracious introduction of my two illustrious guests. It's a privilege for me, Ms. Abby Joseph Cohen and Jeffrey Garten, to be with you. I hope the Biden administration transition team is looking on to see how efficiently in a half an hour we can present prompts how to handle the economy next year. So unfortunately, we have to start with the global economy in turmoil. That is the subject of this panel. And without further ado, I'm going to get right into it by asking both Abby and Jeffrey, if they would, to recap for us the year that has just passed, take a look into the coming year, and try to give us what they found unexpected, what some of the surprises were, how does next year come into play. It was real tragedy today. I just caught the headlines in the evening news to find out that 250,000 Americans had died. New York was shutting down its schools again. The economy continues to waver. So a lot to talk about. I'd like to get your views. So Abby, if you would start, please, and then Jeffrey, I'll turn it over to you. Go ahead, Abby.
Sarwar, thank you very much. And Bill, thank you for that lovely introduction. And good evening to everyone. This clearly is a very strange time in the global economy. And I think everyone has already seen the joke about, is 2020 over yet? I mean, haven't we had enough? There has been plenty of turmoil, economically, politically, and of course, from the medical standpoint. The news today about reaching this really awful milestone with regard to deaths in the United States and of course millions of cases is really quite troubling. And while it's nice to juxtapose that against the good news of vaccine development, we are still quite some distance before our economy and the global economy can start to perform again as if there is no disease present. So let me follow the outline that Sarwar indicated and talk a little bit about 2020, what it means for 2021, and what should we be looking for. 2020 was off to a pretty good start, not just in the United States, but around the world. As far as we can tell, there was not a single economy in recession at the beginning of this year. And clearly, the disease has taken its toll in many different ways. One of the things that we look at a great deal, of course, is the reopening of the economy here and abroad. And one of the things that is very striking to us as we do this analysis is that while there's so much focus on the impact specifically of the pandemic, what we know is that the problems that the pandemic has brought to us has really unveiled some other structural issues that were present anyway. And perhaps one of the things that the pandemic has done has brought forward some of these developments, has intensified some of those developments, and of course has intensified our need to deal with them. What are some of the examples? And I know that Jeffrey would like to speak about some of these as well. One of them has to do with digitization. What we have learned, at least at the higher levels of the service economy, is that an awful lot of work can be done remotely, assuming, of course, that we have the right equipment at home and we have the right computer platforms. Another impact has been on the future of cities. What do we think now about appropriate density of cities, appropriate arrangement of office furniture, how many people should be in an elevator at a time, and so on. But there are some much broader issues that Jeffrey is an expert on that has to do with what has happened to the middle class, not just in the United States, but also other developed economies. And what this pandemic has done has been to unveil some of those ongoing issues in which middle class individuals and families have not been keeping up even before the pandemic. As we take a look at the economic forecast for the remainder of this year and 2021, what we do see is a rebound from the really strikingly low levels of economic activity that we're seeing in the spring and early summer. But we have to be very careful to realize that we're not out of the woods. And I'll just give you two examples. Number one, and most importantly, we're not out of the woods as it comes to COVID-19. The reacceleration of cases in the United States, particularly over the last 2 to 3 weeks, has really been earth-shattering. And we are seeing similarly difficult and troubling numbers in other places, ranging from India to Europe and so on. So issue number one is the path of the disease. I'm not a public health expert, but listening to people who are, even though we believe we have 2 effective vaccines thus far, the distribution of these vaccines could take many, many months. And we really cannot assume that the impact of the disease will just disappear. So that's number one. Number two, and this is of great concern to me, in part because it's not getting very much attention, is we are not yet finished with the economic difficulties that have already occurred. Let me be a little more specific. In the fiscal stimulus, that's not even stimulus, let's call them fiscal rescue packages that were passed by the Congress thus far in 2020, what we have are some programs that will be ending soon. We have some of the paycheck programs that have already ended. We also know that forbearance that has been extended for things like student loan repayments will be ending shortly. Forbearance issued by lending institutions will be ending shortly. Some of the renters relief that has been available in many locations will be ending. Some of the assistance that has been given to small businesses will also be ending. And so we have the possibility of something we can call a forbearance cliff, in which some of the individuals, families, small businesses in the United States that have been able to avoid really awful situations because of these programs, they may be facing a very difficult period of time. Of course, I would be delighted if the Congress were to pass another fiscal rescue package between now and the end of this year, but it's not at all clear that that is going to happen. So I'll just summarize very quickly. Number one, 2020 was a very difficult year in many different ways. 2021, we think will shape up to be a better year because of, let's call it the dead cat bounce from the bad economic data of 2020. But it is not going to be a smooth path because of the progression of the disease and also some of these other obstacles, the forbearance cliff that I mentioned. And finally, something that I've not yet addressed, but I hope we'll have time to speak about, has to do with some of the political instability and political changes that we see throughout the world. The United States will be undergoing a presidential transition, and it remains to be seen what will the new administration want to do and be able to do in the categories of economics and in the category of, let's call it, global economics, including important categories like foreign trade, and also our participation in many of our alliances with our partners around the world, some of them related to trade, some of them related to climate, and so on. So there's an awful lot to discuss, but let me stop here and turn it over to Jeffrey.
Well, that was just a terrific summary. And I think the best that I can do is maybe use what you said and look a little bit at the outside the US and just make a few introductory remarks about our global economic policy and global economic strategy. I think that the Biden administration will waste no time in devoting a lot of attention to the state of our alliances, which I think have deteriorated considerably. And I think one of the things that they will do is, rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. They will make sure that we are a major force in the World Health Organization as opposed to withdrawing from it. And I think they will give a lot of attention to the World Trade Organization, which the Trump administration has really looked askance at. But the fact is that, Abby, it's the things you're talking about that will matter most in terms not only of our domestic welfare, but our international ability to get things done. So we have to get our hands around the pandemic, and we have to rejuvenate the economy. Without that, everything else outside the U.S. has a kind of a cosmetic quality to it. I think it will be very welcomed, but nevertheless, it's the evidence that we are really back in the world is what we are able to do at home. So I think what you described as the agenda really is both the domestic and the international agenda. But let me just say a few things about how the considerations about how America in the global economy will behave, or I should really say the questions. It is really a big question now after the last 4 years as to whether we are going to be an outward-looking economy or one that is much more inward-looking. I think that the Biden administration would like to be outward-looking, but there's going to be a very strong centrifugal force to have what I would call a domestic industrial policy, and to gear a lot of our trade to national security. And these are two areas that we have not really emphasized before, but I think the balance between being outward and inward is really, it's a big question mark. And the second area that I think is very important is our economy is now subject to enormous amount of crises, of global crises. Because of climate change, we're going to see more hurricanes, more flooding, more fires, more pandemics. And I would add to that that we are certainly not out of the woods when it comes to terrorism or cyber terrorism. And I mention all these things because for the first time, at least in my memory, there is going to be an enormous premium on building resilience into our economy. That we have to start with the presumption that the world is crisis prone, that the international interdependence is going to bring these crises more and more to our shores. And we haven't begun to really think through what does it mean to build in the ability not to prevent these things, because I'm not sure that we can, but to recover from them and to minimize the costs. And there's a whole agenda here which people really haven't talked about, but I think it will be one of the most important things that we can do over the next several years. So let me stop there and give it back to Sarwar, and we can continue.
If I can add something right now, Sarwar, if you don't mind.
Of course.
And Jeffrey has mentioned the fact that we need to be thinking about building in resilience in our economy. And
Yes.
I would point out that for the last many decades, the United States has been a global leader in investing in the future. We've done it in terms of R&D. We also did it in terms of infrastructure. And one of the things that is really quite striking to me is that over the last 2 or 3 decades, our state and local governments have really pulled back from a lot of their spending in this category. And by the way, the federal government, after doing things like the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the federal highways in the 50s and 60s, the federal government has really kind of ceded all of this to state and local governments. And the point is very interesting because as Jeffrey has just noted, with climate change and all of the impact we will see on public infrastructure and the need to spend more on resiliency, our state and local governments are under enormous duress right now because of the pandemic. Tax revenues are down substantially at the same time that their spending on pandemic-related measures is way up. And so they are even in a less healthy position than they were a year ago with regard to their ability to do this sort of resiliency spending.
Thank you for that. Someone once told me that the biggest job of the chairman of the Federal Reserve is to take the bowl of cherries away when things are going too smoothly. So what I want to do is pose the following question. I think Jeffrey, you and Abby have really laid out the opposing forces that are acting on the country, on the world, on the economy, inward, outward. What I want to ask you is, what if this pandemic goes on for a while? What if there is no way that there is consensus politically? As an example, the New York Times not long ago had this chart going out over 3 to 4 decades that showed that the American middle class, the income, growth had been largely flat. And then they superimposed a chart of China, which dramatically showed the 900 million people that they've raised out of poverty. So here are all these people who believe that they're not being heard, they're not doing well, they don't expect to do well. How does one factor this? And I'll give you a chance to answer that, and then Jeffrey, you, because resilience, preparing for it requires a lot of bipartisan support, a lot of budgeting. How do we factor this in? And is it just possible we are going to be with the pandemic economically till mid-decade?
So let me begin by addressing this critically important subject, and obviously we can't give it adequate time. So let me address it, if I may, in bullet points. Number one, the erosion in real median income in the United States is not a function just of the last small number of years. It started about 20 years ago. And one of the other things that started about that time had to do with, I'll call it the bifurcation of our economy, with some sectors doing enormously well and others not so well. Among the sectors that have performed extremely well include things like technology, pharmaceuticals, which not surprisingly are the two industries that account for the lion's share of R&D spending in the United States over this period of time. These are also industries, along with some others, that tend to employ well-educated individuals and well-educated individuals whose median incomes have been rising during this period of time. Unfortunately, one of the things that has distinguished the last couple of decades in the United States has been that we have not seen that improvement for median wage. And we see that some families are just falling behind. For a while, there was an optical illusion that they were doing okay. They were borrowing to fuel their spending. It's one of the reasons we ended up in the financial crisis 10 years ago. That's not happening now, except the reality has set in. It clearly has political consequences. My concern right now is, well, what can be done about it? One argument is, well, you can educate people better, but you have to make sure that the jobs are present and the jobs can be created. And I'm going to give a couple of very quick responses and then turn it over to Jeffrey, who I think can give a more fulsome discussion looking at it in a broader global scope. Number one, we have to invest in this country, right? We have government spending, but we haven't seen the same level of government investment that we've seen in previous decades. So for example, federal investment in R&D used to be a very substantial share of the federal budget, something on the order of 10 to 12%, and it's now down to almost minuscule single-digit numbers. Number two, we haven't been investing in education. If we're not investing in education, we're not investing in the future. And so there are these kinds of things where we haven't been doing what we should be doing. And the third one, as I mentioned briefly before, is we haven't been investing in infrastructure. When we think about infrastructure, it's not just the things we need basically to mitigate climate damage. What about broadband? You know, those of us who live in cities, we're accustomed to having 95 to 99% coverage. In rural areas of the United States, it's 60%. That right. Also helps explain some of the geographic disparities economically in the United States. We have the educational disparities, we have the geographic disparities. And one final thing about geographic disparity before I turn this back to Dean Garten, and that has to do with healthcare. Something that is so obvious right now as the COVID-19 pandemic is spreading into more rural communities in the United States is the fact that many of these communities do not have the healthcare resources that they need. If you take a look, for example, at the hospitals that have been closed in the United States in recent years, most of them are in rural areas, number one. And number two, if you think about the states that decided not to expand Medicaid, they did not expand Medicaid under Obamacare. Most of those, I hate to say it, are the Republican-led states that are now increasingly afflicted by COVID and don't have the healthcare systems in place to take care of individuals, particularly those individuals who do not have insurance and who don't have the income level to be able to protect themselves.
So Abby, let me come in, and I will apologize to both of you because we're running a little bit late, and I'm going to speed it up. And so, Jeffrey, as you answer this, there's a question that just came up on the screen that I'd also like to throw your way. And this gentleman, Mr. Martins, is asking about the new trade pact that was signed by the 13 Asian countries without the United States. And of course, right before that, its parent was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which didn't include China. So now they've gone ahead and Asia has got this huge pact. And this gentleman is asking, what impact does this have on what the two panelists are talking about? So let me throw that your way as you answer.
Well, my starting point would be that even going back before Trump, there has been a kind of a lessening of support for international trade agreements in the US, and a sense that we haven't been getting out of these agreements what we thought we would, and we were, and a lot of our workers were being hurt by imports that came from liberalization. So I think that even though there was this negotiation for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it was kind of the last throes of enthusiasm for international trade agreements. Unfortunately, the rest of the world didn't see the globe that way. And so over the last 4 years, while we have basically withdrawn or tried to restructure all the agreements that we're in, a lot of other countries got together and concluded agreements on their own without the US. And if anyone 5 years ago would have said that this was possible, they would have been laughed out of the room, because for 70 years, it's been the United States that has taken the lead on international trade. We have been the force for liberalization. We have been the force for enforcing the laws. And so I think that this agreement, which took place in Asia without us, is really a symbol of our need to get back into the arena. Now, having said that, I don't think it's in the cards for a while to have big trade agreements. But there are a lot of other things in the trading arena that would be very important. And just to key on some of the things that Abby was talking about, there's a lot we can do in terms of rules relating to climate. There's a lot we can do in terms of building a global public health infrastructure. I think there's a lot we can do in building technology consortiums with other countries where our companies and our investments are pooled with them. So I see an era actually of a different kind of economic engagement. It doesn't look like what we used to do, which is big trading agreements, tariff reductions, non-tariff barrier harmonization, but something that's much more creative that we can lead and which I think will be very important to the world. For example, just standards. What kind of standards we use for internet privacy. We can be very involved in that stuff, and we could even be leaders. So I'm thinking that we need to be very creative in terms of our economic engagement, but it won't look like it did in, when I was in the Clinton administration, we were doing all kinds of global trade agreements. It won't look like that.
Thank you. There's another question that has come up which deals with America and leadership, and I'm going to mix that into something that I wanted to ask you, which is, why do you think it is a given that America will again be a leader as it was 5 years ago, Clinton era? Why shouldn't China become the leader driving the economy forward? And should we not anticipate that, or at least give it some thought, and not try to be as inimical, as anti-Chinese as we appear to be becoming? The consensus in Washington seems to be, let's go get them. So how do we turn that around? I mean, how do we exist with a country that is about our size economically, is that strong militarily just about in the Indo-Pacific? How does that play into all this when Mr. Biden takes office? And let me start with you, Abby, just a few minutes, and then Jeffrey, you.
Yeah, I would basically say my supposition is that there has been a very significant closing of the gap. And I don't presume that, as was suggested in the question, that 5 years from now we'll be back to where we were. Not at all. I don't think you can rewind the clock. And so we have a situation where the United States hasn't done what it needed to do or previously did. We used to be clearly number one in the world in terms of how much we spent on R&D as a percentage of our economy, as a percentage of GDP. We were dramatically ahead of everyone else. We're now number 8 in terms of R&D spending as a percentage of GDP. And in terms of the actual monies expended, we used to spend 4 times as much as China. China is now spending about as much as we are. And so it's a situation of not just what the United States has done, but what other countries have done in the interim. And by the way, it's not just China. We see, for example, that the nations of Scandinavia and other small, well-educated nations like Israel are developing their people. The educational levels are rising. They're investing heavily. They have business plans, if you will, as nations in terms of how they're going to be growing and growing more strongly. And so Jeffrey's absolutely right that we need to be rethinking the global economy in terms of these new facts on the ground. Now, that's not to say the United States doesn't have some advantages. We are still the world's largest economy. We do have the world's best university system. We have the world's leading companies in technology, pharmaceutical, and a whole host of others. So we're doing fine. We also have the world's largest consumer sector. So there are a number of things that we have, but we need to pull it together, in my view, with cogent policy and also a direction in terms of what are we trying to achieve over the next 5 to 10 years. It's not a question of deregulation. It's not a question of specific talking points, if you will. It's a question of pulling it all together and saying, how will we reestablish our competitiveness by taking advantage of our comparative strength in any number of categories.
So Jeffrey, before I turn it over to you, one other thing I wish you would throw in, which also ties into a question that I think this gentleman is asking, and that is, are there a couple of big initiatives, projects that China and the United States can work together to help this hand-holding and, as Abby called it, thinking about working together that you can think of? So can you build that into your answer?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything Abby has said, and I want to go back to where she started, that we have to deal with our domestic challenges really forthright, or else it doesn't really matter what we say on the international stage. That our credibility as leaders has always been based on the dynamism of our own economy. And we are not right now in a position to lead other countries so long as we have such challenges at home. So dealing with the income distribution, for example, or dealing with investment in technology and R&D or education, all these things that Abby's been talking about, that's sort of the prerequisite. But I think that we still bring to the table, or we would bring to the table in addition to that, some qualities that no one else really has. No other country is as global in its relationships as we are. No other country has the alliances that we do. No other country has, I think, the kind of idea factory that exists in the US in so many different sectors. And so a lot of it is a question of whether we want to meet that challenge of leadership. It won't be, as Abby said, it's not going to look like it did before, but there's always room, even among a lot of dynamic companies, countries and countries that are much bigger than they were before. There's always room for someone at the head of the table, if not, certainly not to dictate the policies, but to try to build consensus and try to create some common standards. And I think there's a market for that, even with China looming so large.
Jeffrey, before I'm going to throw in one more thing I'd like you to please build in, and that is this Belt and Road Initiative that China is creating infrastructure and helping over 160 countries at last count. I mean, if this is even halfway as successful as it looks like it's going to be, they'll have 3 times as many alliances that the US does. I'd just like to throw that out for you to react.
Well, you asked me before some concrete initiatives that would give us more than just opposition to China.
Please.
And I think, one of those would be in the climate area. There's no scenario in which the world is successful in making the transition to a low carbon world without both the US and China cooperating. So I think it's very possible that we would have some very tough trade relationships with them, and at the same time build a partnership in climate. And my guess is they would welcome that, because nobody really wants another Cold War. I think another area would be in the global infrastructure for public health. I mean, we're starting at a very low level, not at zero, but the WTO has shown how much there is to do when there is a pandemic, and how the infrastructure, if not in Europe and not in China, but in all the other developing countries, really needs to be strengthened. And I think that's something that we could contribute to, so long as Abby says, so long as we really upgrade our own public health infrastructure. We can't, we can't be preaching to anyone else right now, because what we have done has been such a miserable failure. In terms of China's Belt and Road Initiative, yeah, I think that's that's a sign of a country that has really become much more global and much more assertive. And I think it just raises the bar for us in terms of what the nature of our leadership will be. But I don't feel that China has all the advantages that everybody is saying. That Belt and Road Initiative is a lot of publicity, and a lot of the recipients are not feeling very good about being embroiled in that. So I guess my bottom line is, if we do the things we should do at home, we have lots of opportunities abroad. And the fact is that whatever bad reputation globalization has, it's not going away. It's only becoming more intense, and we've got to get our arms around it.
And in the few minutes we have left, if each of you were sitting down with the president, telling him the 2 most important things he should do as he comes in, focus on those and try to win through with those 2. What might they be? And Abby, I'll start with you, and then Jeffrey, hand it to you.
You didn't give me any notice of that question. Sorry.
I know, well, I try and keep some surprises, right?
Well, I would say that the number one priority, and I believe that President-elect Biden has already said this, the number one priority is to get the pandemic under control in the United States. Unless the disease is under control, we really can't get our economy under control either. So I would clearly start with that. And the second thing that I believe really deserves a lot more attention than it's getting has to do with the dire state of state and local governments. We expect state and local governments to provide services of all sorts, and we also expect them to balance their budgets on an annual basis. And I just don't see how these state and local governments are going to be able to do that in 2020 without enormous erosion and the sort of support they provide to their populations. And this will continue into 2021. So I think the incoming administration, in addition to thinking about the long term, thinking about the future, with all of the wonderful suggestions that Jeffrey has made, the near-term fixes, I think, have to be public health and has to be financial support for state and local governments, even if that's in kind, providing service to basically substitute for things that state and local governments would have been providing.
Thank you for being a good sport on that one, Mr. Garten.
So I agree with Abby. So let me add two to that. In the spirit of reviving the economy, but also giving our country more resilience, I think we have to have a new kind of social safety net that allows people of middle and low income not to be walloped over the head every time there's a crisis, and not to be at the mercy of Congress to appropriate money with all the politics and uncertainty that entails. So I think we need to have a system that is more automatic. That is, if the economy is collapsing, then the social safety net expands automatically. That these issues of medical assistance, employment assistance, assistance for daycare, all of these things must be more automatic and not at the whim of whatever the political winds are at the time. It's a very cruel system that we have. And this has nothing to do with the dynamism of our economy. But if you believe that resilience is the key to the future, the key to growth, and the key to not sinking every single time we have a crisis, and when there are going to be many more, then we need an automatic pilot system that helps people when they need it. And maybe even taxes the country on the upswing. The other thing I think we really have to repair our alliances. In my view, what has made America strong and will continue to make it strong is that we have a lot of close partners. And of course, Europe is front and center, but there are also lots of Asian countries in ASEAN, South Korea, Japan, we have a tradition of having very close ties with them. And Trump has basically demolished that in a way that is almost unimaginable. Nobody could possibly have imagined how fast he could unravel these ties that are so important to us. And I think we have to get those back on track.
Two more questions have come in. I'll roll them into one and let both of you answer them. One of them asks whether we should go back to the gold standard, and what do you both think about that? And the second one, I think, Abby, you mentioned that internet access is not equal around the country. And a lot of the most vulnerable do not have the kind of access they need. And the person is asking, Mary Mendoza is asking, how would you suggest the administration rectify that. So gold standard, internet access, and I'll start with you, Abby, and then go back to Professor Garten, and I think we'll then be heading to the end of our show. So let's see.
Okay,
Go
so
ahead.
Very quickly, gold standard, no. Next question, funding the internet. There was a proposal made by the Democrats in the Senate, which was a very significant comprehensive infrastructure plan, which included the ability of basically subsidizing some of the carriers to provide internet access. There are different ways to do it. There are the P3 programs, there's the subsidization program, and I think it could be done. It's just a question of saying this is a priority, and we're willing to put the money there. Given the newer technologies, it's not that expensive to do it. It would have been dramatically more expensive 10 or 15 years ago. Now, not so much. And to do so would be to dramatically improve education outcomes for the children and young people in those communities. It would also give additional employment opportunities for adults in the communities.
Come on, Jeffrey, one of you has got to be for the gold standard. What is it?
Well, I think, as you know, I have, I'm just completing a book about a weekend in 1971, August 13th to 15th, actually, when the Nixon administration, in a secret meeting, decoupled the dollar from gold. And I'm telling the story of why did they do that and how did they do that? Because for time immemorial, gold or some other tangible commodity had backed currency. And now we have a world with free-floating, more or less free-floating currencies. But I agree with Abby's one-word opinion. It would be totally ruinous to tie ourselves to any kind of metal. We would find ourselves in a deflationary spiral very, very quickly. And so it was yesterday's system.
Well, listen, Abby Joseph Cohen, Professor Jeffrey Garten, it has been a real pleasure. And again, forgive me for interrupting you to move things along. And I'll now pass it on to my boss, Bill Clifford.
Colleague, Sarwar, colleague, thank you very much for the magnificent job you did, and to our panelists. I just want to say the ideas that you've shared really get at the heart, both in the short term and the medium term, of if we get it right, if the Biden administration gets it right, we can really close the divides and heal the country. You're talking about dealing, of course, with the pandemic straight up and shoring up state and local budgets. Also, how we gear trade to national security, whether there's a solution on the domestic industrial policy front that harnesses our comparative advantages, and as Abby said, investments in education and welfare and infrastructure. These are the keys. I really thank you for sharing your insights there with us. And I have to say, on a personal level, I've followed your careers without you knowing it, both of you, as a reporter from Asia before I got into this job. Jeffrey, you and Mickey Cantor and Ira Shapiro were circumnavigating the globe, and I was in Tokyo and Halifax and Geneva covering those trade talks with the Japanese. And Abby, after that, following what was going on in the tech industry and how Wall Street was behaving and the ripple effect around the globe. You both are just the greatest minds that we can convene on this issue of what the global economy will look like in the year ahead and beyond. So I thank you on behalf of World Affairs Councils. To my colleagues, tomorrow we will continue day 4 of our national conference. We begin at 2 o'clock with another think tank briefing with the Council on Strategic Risks here in DC, looking at all kinds of weapons and what that means for nuclear, biological, and whether we can get non-proliferation to be a reality again. So lots on our agenda. Thank you all again for this evening. We look for your book, Jeffrey. Sarwar, see you at the Foreign Policy Association, and Abby, you too. Good night.